Chapter 13 of The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby by Ellen Thornycroft Fowler. Chapter 13, Gabriel the Man. The weeks passed on, and still Gabriel did not gain strength. There was nothing definite the matter with him. Perhaps it would have been better for him if there had been, since a definite evil demands a definite cure. But he had simply done too much, had overdrawn his account at the Bank of Vitality, and Nature, that most merciless of creditors, was set upon summoning him before her county court, and stationing her bailiffs, weakness and weariness and depression, in his house, until he should have paid her back to the uttermost farthing. At the end of 2 months spent with his mother in the country, Gabriel returned to town to consult the great doctor who had taken his case in hand, and there he was met with the crushing blow that he must, if he ever wished to regain his shattered health and strength, resign the living of St. Etheldreda's and take a country parish for a term of several years. That was the only course open to him, the doctors said, unless he were bent upon suicide. He came back to his mother's well nigh broken-hearted. It seemed as if fortune had indeed been outrageous in pelting him with her slings and arrows. First the disappointment about Fabia, and then this still severer blow about St. Etheldreda's. Love and life-work taken away from him at one fell swoop, just when he thought he was nearing the summit of success in both. And for a time the burden seemed greater than he could bear. He had meant to do such wonderful things with his work before him and Fabia by his side. He had intended to remove mountains and to overthrow principalities and powers, to stand in the forefront of the great battle between good and evil, and to go forth conquering and to conquer. And suddenly he was met by the stern decree, "Thus far shalt thou go and no farther." He was bidden to stand no longer with the ark in the middle of Jordan, but to court ease and obscurity in the backwater of a country parish. Truly the hand of God was heavy upon him just then. And the very fact that he was out of health made it all the harder for him patiently to endure and cheerfully to submit. For a man's faith is often very much affected by his physical condition. Satan understood human nature when he suggested that even the patient Job might curse God to his face when once his flesh and his bone were touched. As a matter of fact, Satan always does understand human nature. It is divine nature that passes his comprehension, so that when, as frequently happens even in this present world, this mortal puts on immortality, Satan's reckonings are upset, and his premises falsified, as indeed happened in the very case quoted above. So poor Gabriel went a day's journey into the wilderness of blighted hope and bitter disappointment, and sat him down under the juniper tree of doubt and despair, with the old cry, "It is enough. Now take away my life." And as he lay in the dark shadow of the juniper tree, behold, as aforetime, an angel touched him, and the angel came in the form of Janet Field. Now, had uninspired humanity been writing the history of Elijah, it would have dealt with this scene in the story very differently. It was a striking moment, a moment when spirits are finely tuned to fine issues. Think of it, a scene with only 2 dramatis personae, and they very choicest of their kind. First, the prophet, who had just played the principal part in the most splendid drama ever written, who had stood upon the summit of Carmel and called down fire from heaven to confound his enemies, and who had then made the very clouds his chariots and refreshed the parched earth with abundance of rain. Did ever conqueror return from a more magnificent victory than this? Did ever mere man before or since constrain clouds and fire and stormy winds to the fulfilling of his word? This was the first person in the drama. The second was no less wonderful, being one of those mysterious beings who excel in strength, one of those sons of God who shouted for joy when the foundations of the earth were laid, chanting their Amen to the Venite of the morning stars. And what did this angelic messenger say to the mighty conqueror who was for the moment overthrown? Did he strengthen him with the recital of past triumphs, or encourage him with a battle song of still greater things to be? Listen! And behold, an angel touched him and said unto him, Arise and eat. No war songs or battle cries or heroics, nothing but such ordinary, everyday, homely comfort as would be given to a weeping child. And there was more than mere comfort, there was tender sympathy, for the angel came again the second time and touched him and said, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. Dear human, commonplace, comfortable words, such words as we should all like to hear in our dejected moments when the road is too stony for us and we fall by the way like tired children, such words as are spoken to one whom his mother comforteth. Thus Gabriel found consolation in the loving sympathy and cheerful companionship of Janet. She talked no heroics to him. She did not attempt to prove by argument that all things are for the best in this best of all possible worlds. She first looked after his bodily comforts, and then shared with him the sorrow of his heart. Her whole walk and conversation was but an amplification of the words, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. Truly, as far as Gabriel was concerned, she was a veritable angel of the Lord. There are many women in this world who would fain give consolation in sorrow to the men whom they love, but they do not know the way. They argue and encourage and cheer and exhort, and yet it is all in vain. Such women would do well to learn a lesson from the angel of Elijah. Gradually Janet became more than an angel to Gabriel, more than one of those heavenly visitants who neither marry nor are given in marriage. She began to occupy the niche in his heart which the defalcation of Fabia had left vacant. It is a true saying that the affections of many men are caught on the rebound, and these, as a rule, are what are commonly known as marrying men. The man who is described by his friends as not a marrying man is rarely, if ever, enslaved in this way. His affections, when once wounded and repulsed, are even more impregnable than they were before. There are two kinds of bachelors in this world: the men in the walls and structures of whose hearts are empty niches, all ready for the image of the unknown goddess, just as in some houses there are bookshelves built into the original fabric; and the men who have no place prepared when Diana of the Ephesians falls straight down from Jupiter, and consequently walls have to be knocked down and other furniture removed to make room for her. Carr belonged to the former class. From his boyhood he had worshipped the ideal woman. Feminine sympathy and companionship and approbation were essential to him. He could not live without them. Therefore, when, as he imagined, Fabia had once embodied the ideal, he could not again, even though Fabia had failed, disembody her. If he had not first fallen in love with Fabia, he would probably never have fallen in love with Janet. But the door of his heart having once been thrown open by Fabia, it would not close again. So Janet found at last an easy entry. She would never have succeeded in opening that door herself. She lacked the special power to do so. But after another hand had forced the lock, there was no one so well fitted as she to enter in and sweep and garnish. Janet was one of the rare women who are proficient performers on that useful instrument popularly known as the second fiddle. It is a great gift. The women who are content to play second fiddle, and to make the best of it, give much sweet music to the world. There are no more essential performers in the orchestra of life than they. Do we not all know them, and the soothing harmonies which they make? Patient spinsters, kindly stepmothers, comfortable second wives, humbly and cheerfully taking the part allotted to them by the great conductor, and never struggling nor straining after the first place. Are not all our lives the richer for their music? And can we doubt that these blessed musicians shall take one day a leading part in that chorus, which shall stand on the shores of the sea of glass, striking the harps of God? Janet was aware that she was not Gabriel's first love. During the sunny afternoons of that long summer holiday he had confided in her the whole story of his infatuation for Fabia and the disappointment that it had brought him, and she was content that it should be so. He was so utterly first with her that she never even asked what place she took with regard to him. It was enough for her to love. She did not trouble about any return. There is always something rather small about the jealous woman, the woman who refuses to marry a widower, or who begs her husband to promise her that he will never marry again should anything happen to her. Something is lacking in the quality of her love. At the bottom of her heart she loves herself more than she loves him. Were her love perfect, she would want him to be happy, even at the cost of his memory of her. She would be content to be forgotten if only he could be comforted. The maternal element in her love would help her to this, and the wife who has no maternal element in her love for her husband falls considerably short of the mark of her high calling. But fate was not without its irony for poor Gabriel, even in the compensations of his present lot. It was hard that he should at last have fallen in love with Janet, just when the fiat had gone forth that he had no home to offer to her. Had he only learnt her true value any time during the past half-dozen years, he could have married her at once, and in all human probability his health in that case would never have broken down at all, for Janet was just the sort of wife to look after a man well, and to see that he was cherished and comforted as well as honoured and obeyed. But like many another good man, Gabriel did the right thing at the wrong time, and was sorely punished, as are all such innocent offenders, for the unpunctuality of his well-doing. So while Janet soothed him in his dual disappointment over his slighted love and his arrested life work, she unconsciously drove him out of the fire of transitory infatuation for Fabia into the frying pan of unswerving devotion to herself, and thus rendered the second state of poor Gabriel worse than the first. He could not tell her in so many words of his new-born love for her. Honour forbade it now that he had neither home nor income to offer. But Janet, though not a clever woman in the accepted sense of the word, was quite clever enough to see what had come to pass, and to be thankful accordingly. It was characteristic of her that she did not waste her time nor her strength in regretting that Gabriel had not learnt to love her sooner. She returned thanks that he had not postponed this awakening until even later, and the mere knowledge of it made melody in her heart. "I expect I must give up St. Etheldreda's, and give it up at once," said Gabriel one summer's evening, as he and his mother and Janet were sitting in the garden of the little Midland cottage. "I cannot extend my holiday further, and it is time that my successor was appointed and given his work to do. But I shall miss it. Oh, I shall miss it." His voice broke as he concluded the sentence. Gabriel had one of those impressionable natures which rise to great heights and sink to great depths. He was always either upon Mount Carmel or lying down under the juniper tree. "As you say, dearest," replied Mrs. Carr, "it seems time that something definite should be done, as no locum tenens can stay permanently anywhere because of his own work at home, and being a stranger and a sojourner, as it were, and therefore the course of teaching more disjointed than in the case of the real incumbent, besides his not having the threads of all the parishioners in his hands, and so less able to administer advice and counsel." "It is hard to give it all up," Gabriel groaned, "and just when I was getting some hold upon the hearts of the people." "Never mind," said Janet in soothing tones, "it will all come right." "But I must mind. I cannot help minding. It is my business to mind." Janet shook her head. "No, it isn't. It is your business to get strong and well as quickly as you can, and God's business to look after St. Etheldreda's." "Oh, yes, love, yes, of course it is. How clearly dear Janet always puts things! You must have faith, my Gabriel, more faith. Think of the grain of mustard seed that the woman hid in 3 measures of meal till it leavened the whole lump. It is faith of that kind that you need, dear child, and in fact all of us." Mrs. Carr was apt to confuse her parables, but she held fast to the truths which they set forth. "It is so easy to have faith for other people, and so hard to have it for oneself," sighed Gabriel. "But the fact that a duty is difficult does not make it any the less imperative." "That is so, dearest Janet," asserted Mrs. Carr. "If we have to do things, we have to do them, however impossible they may be, and not even in good health or up to our usual spirits, which always makes everything more of a burden than otherwise, and increases the necessity for a strong tonic and complete rest of mind and body. And even if, as Janet so wisely counsels, I leave my work in God's hands, what is to become of me, deprived suddenly of home and income?" Janet smiled. "You think that God is equal to the task of looking after St. Etheldreda's, but not quite to be trusted with the responsibility of looking after you as well? Oh, Gabriel, I'm ashamed of you." Here his mother flew to Gabriel's rescue. "Really, Janet, love, I cannot allow you to speak of my own ewe lamb in that way. You seem to insinuate that Gabriel is guilty of irreverence towards his Maker, which anything further from his thoughts I cannot imagine. But one cannot help feeling that the charge of a parish is more worthy to be left in the hands of the Creator than attending to a man's private income, which is really a layman's duty, or even a mere man of business." Depressed as Gabriel was, he could not forbear a smile at this, especially when he saw Janet's hazel eyes twinkle in sympathy. It was so thoroughly indicative of Mrs. Carr's attitude towards her Maker, whom she regarded as a sort of deified archbishop, not to be troubled with affairs unconnected with the Church. "If you think that, mother, you ought never to say grace before meat. Surely it is what you would call a mere layman's duty to preside over a meal and to bless common food to our use." "My dear Gabriel, I have always said grace before meat, and always shall. It is no use your trying to dissuade me from it. It was my custom in my cradle, as it will be my custom upon my deathbed, taught me by my dear mother, and a meal upon which no blessing is asked always terrifies me, for fear of undigested food or fishbone in the throat, if not ptomaine poisoning and typhoid in the milk. I never should expect to recover from a meal upon which no blessing had been asked, not even if the fish were boned and there was only semolina pudding. And by what right, I should like to know, except the Lord build the house, men sow and reap in vain." Gabriel suppressed a laugh as he wondered what his mother would do if she were asked to parse one of her own sentences. "It's all right, mother. You misunderstood me. I am the last person to object to your asking grace before meat." But Mrs. Carr was a past mistress in the art of misunderstanding people. Nothing was too plain or too simple for her to misunderstand. She even amazed her own son sometimes by her powers of misapprehension. "Then why did you say so, my dear love, and cause me so much pain? Both you and Janet are so fond of saying things and then saying that you didn't say them, which makes it so confusing for the other person, with the best intentions in the world. If you don't object to my saying grace, why did you say you did? And if dear Janet doesn't think you irreverent, why does she say you are? Everybody being judged by their words, or else how could you know them at all? What I want to know is, what will become of me after I have resigned the living of St. Etheldreda's?" Gabriel's passing amusement was over, and he was down in the depths again. "Something is sure to turn up," the cheerful Janet hastened to assure him. "I feel certain that God will look after you, even though it be but secular work to do so." Janet could not resist making fun of Mrs. Carr sometimes, though, to do her justice, she struggled manfully against the temptation. "What you need, my dear boy, is more faith and hope, and a country parish, though not too scattered in case of bad weather, and the squire at your back should the funds run short, and no private means." "But how am I to get a country parish, mother? It is none so easy, and especially as I need one with an income sufficient to keep me from starvation, having, as you point out, no private means." "True, love, they do not grow on every bush like sand on the sea shore, as you say: but there must be plenty somewhere, or else why aren't all the clergy in the workhouse? Though, as Janet is always saying, it is no credit to the Church of England that they are not, being so miserably underpaid, and the labourer always worthy of his hire." "Certainly the Nonconformists set us a good example there, though sometimes not Catholic in doctrine: and of course you would find it a little dull, after the constant toil and turmoil of a London parish, which would make it so much more soothing and restful. I often wish that my small means were sufficient to do more than just keep Janet and myself: but it is often difficult for us as it is to make both ends meet, even pinching ourselves at every turn, and only one joint of meat a week." "It is supper time," said Janet, rising and folding up her work, "and I propose that we go in and enjoy it, and don't take thought for the morrow any more to night. There's steak and kidney pie, and a junket, both of which I made myself, because I knew that they were two of Gabriel's favourite dishes, and it is no good making them disagree with us all before we eat them through worrying over what can't be helped." "Thank you, Janet." Gabriel was touched. He was one of the men, and their name is Legion, who love to be petted. "And for my part," added Janet, as they strolled towards the house, "I have perfect confidence that God will find a way for us out of this difficulty, and prove himself a very present help in the present trouble." "Why, you always preach so beautifully about faith, Gabriel." "I know I do: but it is so much easier to preach than to practise." "It isn't easy to do either on an empty stomach," said the practical Janet. "So let us have supper at once." End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby by Ellen Thornycroft Fowler. Chapter 14. The Living of Gaythorne. There was woe and lamentation in the parish of Gaythorne over the death of the rector, who had held the incumbency for the last 35 years. As he had been a man somewhat lax with regard to Catholic doctrine, and wholly inartistic in respect to canonical form, Mrs. Gaythorne had no anxiety as to his condition in the future state. but she missed a friendship which had lasted through the whole of her life as matron and widow, and she shrank from the idea of a new incumbent who would not obey her as implicitly as Mr. Cattley had done. True, the latter had suffered from occasional lapses in obedience. There was one never to be forgotten occasion when he introduced the custom of carrying out the psalmist's original intention and singing the songs of degrees, instead of reading them aloud alternately with the congregation, which daring innovation so upset Mrs. Gaythorne that for some time she absented herself from her parish church and attended a Wesleyan chapel in the neighbourhood. But even here the poor lady could not long find rest for her soul, for when the season for it came round, the Wesleyans thought it meet and right to offer a public thanksgiving to God for the joy of harvest, and they decorated their chapel for this occasion with corn and flowers. This was too much for Mrs. Gaythorne. She scented ritualism in every dahlia, popery in every ear of corn, and when she espied upon the front of the pulpit the sign of her salvation wrought in white chrysanthemums, to bring before the faithful the symbol of their faith, she shook the dust of the place off her feet for ever, and left the chapel to re-enter it no more. But she did not go so far as to withdraw her subscription to the Wesleyan Missionary Society in consequence, in which perhaps she was somewhat inconsistent, since the object of all missionary societies is to take their part in fulfilling the divine command to preach to every creature that cross which was to the Jew a stumbling block and to the Greek foolishness, and to Mrs. Gaythorne the sign manual of Rome. But her practices were ever superior to her precepts, and she always atoned by the kindliness of her conduct for the cruelty of her creed. So she returned into the fold of her own parish, and gradually forgave Mr. Cattley for his unseemly attempt to carry out the intentions of the original authors in his presentment of the Psalms, but she continued to read these same spiritual songs in a loud voice while the rest of the congregation were singing them. Once again was Mr. Cattley convicted of backsliding by the introduction of the singing of those responses which fall to the people and not to the priest. Mrs. Gaythorne did not leave the church again for that, her recent experience at the Wesleyan chapel having made her feel somewhat like Noah's dove before the abatement of the waters. But she entered her protest by still repeating the responses in as conversational a tone as she could command, and beginning them a good 2 seconds before anybody else. The living of Gaythorne was a very good one, as livings go nowadays, 500 a year and an excellent rectory, and the income was regular and secure, not being dependent upon either glebe or tithes, so there was much speculation as to who would be Mr. Cattley's successor. "Who has the presentation to this living?" asked Fabia of her husband a few days after the old rector's death. "It belongs to me," replied Charlie, by which he meant to his mother. "I thought so, and I want you to give it to Gabriel Carr." "Oh, Fabia!" And poor Charlie's distress was poignant. He adored his wife, and would do anything in reason that she asked him, but he did wish she would not ask him such unreasonable things. Mrs. Charles Gaythorne shrugged her shoulders impatiently. "It is no use saying 'Oh, Fabia,' in that timorous and ineffective tone. I have told you what my wishes are, and I expect you to carry them out." "But, Fabia——" "But me no buts, if you please. Surely you can make anybody rector here that you like, seeing that even if you cannot call your soul your own, you can so call the living of Gaythorne." Charlie winced. His wife's gibes never failed to touch him on the raw. "But, Fabia, darling, you must see that mother would never consent to a high churchman being appointed rector here." "I thought you said the living was in your gift." I did, but then I failed to see where your mother comes in." Poor Charlie fairly groaned. "Oh, Fabia, I really couldn't go against my mother in a thing like this. She minds so awfully about churches and services and things of that kind, that I should feel a regular brute if I didn't pan it all out to suit her." Fabia's lips curled. Her husband's fear of his mother never failed to arouse her contempt. "Then you do not mind going against your wife's wishes?" "Yes, I do, darling. I mind most awfully. But can't you understand that religion is the mater's particular hobby, while it isn't yours? I mean, you don't really care about High Church or Low Church and all that sort of business, while it is just meat and drink to mother. I believe it would kill her to have a regular High Churchman planted down under her very nose. She couldn't stand it at her age." "That is simply absurd. She would soon get used to it." "Not she. I know my mother. You can't remember what an awful shindy she made when old Cattley took to bawling out the psalms all together, instead of making them into a sort of ride and tie business, turn and turn about, as they used to be. But I can, and I shall never forget it. By Jove, it regularly knocked her to pieces." Fabia still occupied the seat of the scornful. "I thought the psalms were meant to be sung. Songs usually are." "Not a bit of it. Why, nobody ever thought of singing them at Gaythorne Church till old Cattley got a ridiculous idea into his head that it would be an improvement, or some idiotic notion of that kind, and it upset the mater most dreadfully. She forgave the old fool after a bit, because she is so awfully Christian and charitable and all that, don't you know? But the church has never been the same to her since. I was quite a little boy at the time, but I remember the fuss." "And what did your father say?" "Oh, father did his best to smooth her down. Said that a psalm was a psalm, don't you know, and comforting things of that sort. But it drove her to the Wesleyan chapel for all that, for weeks and weeks. She used to take me with her while father stuck to the parish church, and I used to enjoy it. It was a bit of a change for a little chap whose nose was generally glued to the prayer book in his family pew." Fabia smiled. Her husband's ideas and traditions never failed to rouse her mirth. "Then did Mr. Cattley ever go so far as to sing the hymns, or were they also performed on what you call the ride and tie principle in those primeval days?" she asked. Charlie looked at her in innocent amazement. "Of course they sang the hymns. What are hymns for but to be sung?" "The same argument applies then to singing the psalms, since psalms are hymns." "They can't be, because they are in the prayer book: and the prayer book and the hymn book are quite different books, don't you know? You might as well say that the army list and the racing calendar are the same as say that the prayer book and the hymn book are." "Well, then, you Anglicans hold that the Bible and the prayer book are very much the same thing, don't you?" retorted Fabia, who could never resist the temptation to wave the red rag when she saw one lying about. Her husband looked really shocked. "Good gracious, no! What an idea! I'm glad the mater didn't hear you say that: it would upset her awfully. Why, nothing would induce her to read what she calls her daily portion out of the prayer book psalms. She wouldn't do it for anything. She always reads them out of the regular Bible." "I see. Why," continued Charles, waxing eloquent, "when I was a little chap at school, she found out that the master who took the Scripture form made us learn some of the prayer book psalms by heart, and she kicked up an awful row about it. Wrote to the head, don't you know, and insisted on her son learning the psalms as they really were in the Bible, or not at all." "That is enough about the psalms," said Fabia in a bored tone of voice. "What I want to know is, are you going to oblige me about the living of Gaythorne, or are you not? In short, are you going to offend me or your mother?" Charlie looked, as indeed he felt, absolutely wretched. He hated to deny his wife anything that she desired, but the alternative was by no means an alluring one. He could have faced a charge of cavalry without turning a hair, but when it came to facing his mother it was a different thing, and the flesh was weak. So he feebly temporised. "I don't believe mother would ever stand Carr's goings on, his flowers and vestments and early services and things of that kind." "But she is very fond of him," said Fabia, stooping to argue with her trembling lord and master. "Oh, that's quite a different thing. She can't help liking him as a man. Nobody could. He is such a pleasant chap that nobody would ever take him for a clergyman," replied Charlie, with unconscious humour. "But it's as a parson that he roughs her up." "Of course you are master in your own house, and so must do as you think fit," said Fabia, with a satirical smile. "I have told you my wishes, and there is no more to be said: but I should have imagined that you might have done it for Mr. Carr's sake, if not for mine. You must see how hard it is for him to have to give up one living with no prospect of another." "Oh, I'm sorry enough for Carr, there's no doubt on that score," Charlie ruefully replied. "He's a rattling good fellow, and it's deuced hard on him to have to chuck everything like this — deuced hard. But all the same I can't have my mother's peace of mind sacrificed to him, and there's an end of it." Fabia rose from her seat and left the room, her clinging robes trailing gracefully behind her. She did not deign to vouchsafe another word to her recalcitrant husband, whose misery was very real indeed. Poor Charlie! He was highly inexperienced in his management of Fabia. If he had put his foot down and said that he would not give the living to Carr because he did not choose to do so, she would have submitted to his decision with a good grace, and would have respected him for knowing his own mind, even if it did not coincide with hers. But when he refused to do so on the ground that his mother did not wish it, he threw over his prestige as a husband and lowered himself in his wife's eyes. A wise man never backs up his marital authority by quotations from any woman, not even from his own mother: for wives despise a constitutional government, and at heart love the despot who rules them by divine right. Provided, of course, that he is not too despotic and does not take undue advantage of his kingship: and they invariably support the Salic law, and will have no woman, not even a mother-in-law, to reign over them. Now, if the truth must be told, Fabia understood Mrs. Gaythorne a great deal better than Charlie did. She knew that underneath the ferocity of that lady's creed was concealed the tenderest of hearts, and that the worthy woman's doings were as overflowing with charity as her doctrines were the reverse. So she retailed to Mrs. Gaythorne the exhaustive account of Gabriel's afflictions which she had received by letter from Isabel Seaton, and left the seed thus sown to bear fruit accordingly. Charlie's mother, though an excellent woman and a consistent Christian, was most delightfully human: and consequently she was so much pleased with Gabriel for having ruined his health, as she believed, by his high church practices, thereby proving that she was righteous in her judgments and justified in her sayings, that she completely forgave the sinner in contemplating the satisfactory results of the sin. So, after hearing several times the full account of poor Gabriel's overthrow, as written by Isabel and illustrated by Fabia, she went to spend a day with her old friend Eveline Carr, in order to see for herself how the land lay. Mrs. Carr and Mrs. Gaythorne were friends of long standing, and were warmly attached to each other: all the more warmly because they did not understand one another in the very least. Many sincere and constant friendships are thus founded upon a basis of profound and mutual misunderstanding. We are all of us prone to esteem certain people for qualities which they do not, and never have pretended to, possess: but we, in the vain imagination of our hearts, have endowed them with these qualities, and feel affection for them accordingly. Mrs. Gaythorne loved Mrs. Carr for being a mystic of deep and clear spiritual perceptions, with an intuitive conception of the mysteries of evangelical dogma: while Mrs. Carr reverenced Mrs. Gaythorne as a broad-minded and experienced woman of the world, equally conversant with the wisdom of God and the foolishness of man. "This is an unfortunate business, Gabriel, that I heard from Isabel Seaton about your health," began Mrs. Gaythorne, when the preliminary greetings were over and the party had seated themselves at what was Mrs. Gaythorne's lunch and the Carrs' dinner. "A very unfortunate business." Some people would have left the discussion of unpleasant subjects until the meal was over, but that was not Mrs. Gaythorne's way. What she had to say she said, regardless of any other consideration whatsoever. She was a woman distinguished by singleness of purpose and freedom of utterance. Gabriel sighed. "It is a great trouble and a bitter disappointment to me to have to give up St. Etheldreda's. I can assure you of that, Mrs. Gaythorne." "Then why talk about it?" interrupted Janet. "I never see the use of talking about disagreeable things, especially at meal times." Mrs. Gaythorne turned upon her a look of reproach. "I have come here for the sole purpose of talking about it, Janet Field. So it must be talked about, meal time or no meal time. I cannot consider the meat that perisheth when I have Gabriel's soul under my consideration." But Janet had her reply ready. "It was Gabriel's body that I was thinking about, Mrs. Gaythorne, and as his soul just now is in a far better condition than his body, I think it is the latter that should claim our attention." "Still, dearest Janet," said Mrs. Carr, feeling electricity in the air and being intent on peace, "a body without a soul is not of much avail, even in a country parish with no daily service, and the litany on Wednesdays and Fridays, which is what I crave for my boy just now, complete rest and absence from all worry being the thing prescribed. Though I admit that when one scents the sound of danger one should profit by the warning, and husband the lost strength until it has regained its accustomed tone and vigour." "I am not surprised," replied Mrs. Gaythorne, saying what she had come to say. What could any man expect from daily services and all the other performances at St. Etheldreda's but a complete breakdown in his health? "I knew it would come to this from the very beginning, and it has." The good lady conveyed the impression that if it had not, she would have been as much disappointed as the prophet Jonah at the sparing of Nineveh. Gabriel was distinctly amused. Mrs. Gaythorne never made him angry. "I did the little I could, and am thankful that my health allowed me to do as much as I did, but I grieve sorely that it prevents me from doing more." "There is nothing to grieve over in that, Gabriel Carr. Be thankful you are prevented from doing any more mischief in that benighted parish, instead of fretting that you are prevented from doing any more good." "I will gladly raise that Te Deum, Mrs. Gaythorne," replied the persecuted vicar, stifling a laugh. "But all the same I did my best." "According to your lights," added Mrs. Gaythorne, amending his sentence. "Certainly, I accept the emendation, but no one can act save according to his lights. You cannot yourself, Mrs. Gaythorne." "But I take care to see that my lights are the right lights. That makes all the difference." "How do you know that they are the right lights?" asked Janet. The lady looked at her more in sorrow than in anger. "What an absurd question, Janet Field. How do I know that the sun is shining above our heads?" "You don't," retorted Janet, "because, as a matter of fact, it isn't. There is no above or below in space." Mrs. Gaythorne shook her head reproachfully. "Janet Field, I perceive you are becoming a freethinker, if not an atheist, and that is quite as bad, if not worse, than being High Church. I do not approve of young people filling their heads with all these modern speculations." But Janet held her ground. "It is not modern at all. It is a notion that dates from the days of De Quincey, not to say from the foundation of the world. Don't you remember that magnificent passage of his where he says that among the constellations Above was below, below was above. Depth was swallowed up in height insurmountable. Height was swallowed up in depth unfathomable. It is one of the finest paragraphs ever written. I do not approve of De Quincey. He took too much of something. I forget what it was, but I know he would have been a great deal better without it. Still, argued Janet, he proved that there are really no such things as height and depth in space. Nothing of the kind, replied the indomitable. He proved that he did not know the difference between above and below himself. But there was nothing remarkable in that. Persons who take too much of anything frequently confuse the two. Hear, hear, cried Gabriel in applause. In this respect the meeting is entirely with you. Besides, Mrs. Gaythorne continued triumphantly, if there is not an above or below, there cannot be a heaven or hell. And if that is so, what is to become of us all, I should like to know? Gabriel laughed outright. Mrs. Gaythorne's theology never failed to afford him the keenest pleasure. Here the hostess thought it time to interfere, as she was afraid that the young people were not showing proper respect to their guest. Of course, dear Mrs. Gaythorne, as you say, we couldn't possibly do without heaven and hell, both as a punishment and an inducement, modern theology being so lax in matters of doctrine, although very charitable in all good works. And though we are expressly told that the spirit matters quite as much as the letter, yet we must pay attention to the articles of our faith, or else where should we be? I would rather not express an opinion, answered Mrs. Gaythorne. All I can say is, that I feel sure De Quincey knows the difference well enough by now, and wishes that he had not taken quite so much of that stuff that made him confuse the two. Gabriel and Janet were rocking themselves to and fro in a silent ecstasy of mirth, but their levity fortunately was hid from Mrs. Gaythorne, who calmly continued, "And now that my prognostications have been fulfilled, and you have ruined your health by your empty forms and ceremonies, I want to know what you are going to do for a living, Gabriel Carr." "That is just what I want to know myself, Mrs. Gaythorne. I have no private means at all, and my mother has only just enough to keep herself and Janet, so that now I have been compelled to resign the living of St. Etheldreda's, there seems nothing before me but the workhouse." "I never approved of the name of that church," said Mrs. Gaythorne. "I never approve of any saints that do not come out of the Bible. They seem to me popish." "Gabriel didn't christen the church," suggested Janet in extenuation. "I have nothing to do with that. All I say is that I do not approve of fancy saints." "Yet the lives of some of them were very beautiful," said Mrs. Carr. "Think of St. Francis of Assisi preaching to the birds as he sat on a gridiron heated 7 times hotter, if it wasn't St. Lawrence, which I almost think it was. And then St. Catherine whirling round on fireworks till she was burned up, and St. Sebastian pierced all over with arrows, which had poisoned heads and barbed points. Surely all these set us a beautiful example, though of course to be adapted to modern needs, manners and customs being so different now to what they were then, and arrows and gridirons being used for such different purposes, or not at all." "I should like a few words alone with Gabriel," said Mrs. Gaythorne, when lunch was over. It was not her custom to beat about the bush and intrigue for tête-à-têtes, as it is the custom of some women. So Mrs. Carr and Janet retired and left the two others together. "Now, Gabriel," the lady began, "you have brought this illness upon yourself by your own foolishness. There is no doubt on that score. But what is done, and it is no good harping on it any further. The thing we have to consider is what is to be done now." "Precisely, Mrs. Gaythorne. That is what I have been considering for several weeks, and I am as far away from any conclusion as I was when I began." "Then I am not. I have decided to tell my son Charles to confer upon you the living of Gaythorne." Gabriel was dumbfoundered. He understood perhaps better than any one what it must have cost Mrs. Gaythorne to make this decision, and he felt almost overpowered by the magnitude of her sacrifice. "But, dear Mrs. Gaythorne, consider what you are doing." "I have considered. I am not one to act without due consideration. I am not of your way of thinking upon many subjects. No one knows that better than I do. And though I would do anything in my power to please you, dear Mrs. Gaythorne, I could not put aside my own convictions for you or for anybody. I mean that if I were appointed to the living of Gaythorne, I should feel it my duty to conduct the worship of God as I believe He has ordained, and not as I think my parishioners desire. In some things a minister of religion is the servant of all, but in others he owes no allegiance to any but to the Master himself, and to Him alone he is responsible. And I believe that the form in which he worships the Master is one of these latter things. I want you fully to understand this before you allow your son to appoint me rector of Gaythorne." "I do fully understand it. I know you well enough to be aware that you are as obstinate as possible where your conscience is concerned." "As obstinate as I am myself, and I respect you for it." Gabriel could hardly forbear smiling. "And yet you wish me to become rector of Gaythorne?" "I do, although I know that you will do many things of which I heartily disapprove, and that you will count them to yourself for righteousness. But as I grow older I am beginning to see that the spirit is of vastly more importance than the letter, and that it is possible to serve God in various ways, though I never shall believe that one way is quite as acceptable to Him as another. But I have learnt to say from my heart, 'Grace be to all them that love our Lord Jesus Christ,' in sincerity, even though they show their love in ways that personally I have no sympathy with. And I do believe that you love our Lord Jesus Christ in sincerity, although I admit that you are prone to display your devotion in an extremely undesirable fashion. Therefore I shall command my son to offer you the living of Gaythorne, since I believe it would be better for the parish to be ruled by a misguided man who truly loves God than by one of my own way of thinking who does not." Gabriel's eyes filled with tears of gratitude as he took his old friend's hand and kissed it. "I can never express in words what I feel about this matter, Mrs. Gaythorne. I am not only profoundly grateful to you for thus coming to my help in a time of sore need, but I am even more grateful for the testimony you bear to my efforts in the past to do what is right, by offering me the charge of your own parish to a man who does not see by any means eye to eye with you on many religious questions. And I swear to you that I will do all in my power to prevent you from ever regretting the choice into which you have been led by the kindness of your warm and loving heart. So help me God." Thus Gabriel went on his way, and the angels of God met him in the forms of Janet Field and Mrs. Gaythorne, and the Lord sent him bread and meat, as well as the spiritual comfort of the still small voice. So he went forward rejoicing, little dreaming of the darkness of desolation which awaited him. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby by Ellen Thorneycroft Fowler. Chapter 15. The Lost Rector. Gabriel had not long been appointed rector of Gaythorne before he became engaged to Janet Field, and he had not long been engaged to Janet Field before he married her. It was a quiet wedding in the little village in the Midlands where his mother lived, and as it was now November, the newly married pair went south for their honeymoon in order to catch the last flutter of autumn's skirts before she faded into winter altogether. Janet was in the seventh heaven of delight. To be Gabriel's wife was to her the summit of earthly bliss. the one supreme happiness which she had dreamed of ever since her girlhood, as too absolutely ideal ever to be realized. Gabriel also was content in that peaceful fashion which, to a highly strung temperament, is far more satisfying than any fiercer emotion. Fabia was greatly annoyed at the marriage of the new rector. Had she known he would bring a helpmeet with him to the rectory, she would not have moved heaven and earth to compass his appointment. She still loved him all the more for his rejection of herself, but she hated his wife with the intense hatred of the woman scorned for her successful rival. It is a noteworthy fact that a woman can forgive a rival who is better looking than herself far sooner than one who is not so well favoured. Beauty is the one thing in which women acknowledge each other's superiority. The woman who is more attractive and yet not so handsome as another is beyond the pale of pardon. Therefore the beautiful and distinguished Fabia could not forgive the ordinary-looking girl who had won the love of Gabriel Carr after she herself had forfeited it. Moreover, Fabia had found her own husband utterly incapable of supplying her intellectual needs, and she had imagined that Gabriel, as a spiritual adviser, might help to fill the vacuum thus created. But to the woman who regards the confessional as a luxury rather than as a discipline, a married confessor is not nearly so satisfactory as a single one. A strong argument in favour of, or perhaps against, the celibacy of the clergy. Finding her hopes of Gabriel's supporting friendship fruitless, Fabia took to writing long letters to her cousin Ramchandar, confiding to him her unsatisfied longings for suitable intellectual companionship, and begging him to come to England to console and help her. At first he refused, being offended by her marriage, but it was not long before she thought she saw unmistakable signs of his relenting. Mrs. Gaythorne was delighted about Gabriel's marriage. She was one of the women who heartily approve of matrimony and highly disapprove of the reverse. An old maid was always visited with her severest censure, and she meted out as unqualified a condemnation to the woman who did not marry as to the woman who ate and drank anything between meals. Gabriel and Janet went for their honeymoon to a little inn on the borders of Dartmoor, and revelled in the exquisite and yet awe-inspiring scenery of that part of England's most beautiful county to their hearts' content, discussing at the same time every subject under the sun and above it, in the delightful intimacy and comradeship of married life. It is only when the twain are one mind as well as one flesh that the true happiness of marriage is realized, and this was the case with Gabriel and his wife. "The only thing that I don't like about Dartmoor is the prison," remarked Janet one day, as they were sitting together in the twilight, which now seemed to come almost in the middle of the afternoon. "I hate to think of all those wicked people being so near us." "Poor souls, I'm sorry for them, whoever they may be," said the sympathetic Gabriel, "and whatever they may have done." But Janet was not made of such slight elements. "I'm not, and I daresay you wouldn't be if you knew more about them." "Yes, I should, my love. I should be all the sorrier." Janet shook her small brown head slowly. "I'm never very sorry for people who bring things on themselves. If they do wrong, they ought to be punished." "And they generally are, my child. God may forgive, but nature and the world never do." "And quite right, too." Janet could be very hard upon occasion. "You can never judge any man's sins until you know what his temptations have been, Janet." And as only God knows that, only God can judge. The newspapers can tell us what some poor wretch has done, who is now being punished for his sins in that gloomy prison. But only God could tell us how sorely he has been tempted, and how often he resisted temptation before he finally fell. And God will remember it to his credit when the day of reckoning comes. But some of the prisoners have been very wicked people. So they may have been, but we do not know that we should have turned out any better had we their temptations and been put in their place. Janet looked horrified at the bare suggestion. I don't think that it is likely that we should take to flat burglary. No, that would not be any temptation to people brought up as we have been, my dearest. But we may be beset by other temptations which will prove too strong for us. I think there is no text which is more necessary to be constantly borne in mind by so-called good people than let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. For it is when we are most certain of our firm footing on the narrow way that the danger of falling is at its zenith. Well, anyhow, I'm sure that no temptation would ever be strong enough to make you do anything wrong, Gabriel. My darling, how little you know me. Do you remember the story of holy John Bradford, who, on seeing a murderer being led to the gallows, exclaimed, "There, but for the grace of God, goes John Bradford"? When I was in the East End, I never saw any poor wretch being taken up by the police without saying to myself, "There, but for the grace of God, goes Gabriel Carr." Dearest, I hate to hear you say such things. I cannot help that, Janet. You must know me as what I am, and not as what you think I ought to be. I know that you are one of the best men that ever lived. Gabriel smiled and stroked the brown head that was leaning against his knee, for Janet, unlike Isabel Seton, had hair that was never the worse for any amount of stroking. But even though a man may smile at the extravagance of his wife's admiration for himself, it has an extremely soothing effect upon him. The doctrine of infallibility of the husband is a very comfortable one both to worshipper and worshipped. So much so that it is a pity it has gone, to a great extent, out of fashion. "I am far from being one of the best men that ever lived, my dear," he said, "but all the same it is rather nice to know that you think I am. I shall always think so. I believe you will, my Janet, and as far as I am concerned it is a most comforting heresy. But all the same you must learn not to judge other people so harshly. I think it is very difficult for a really good woman not to be rather hard. Nevertheless, she ought not to be." "Do you think I am hard, Gabriel?" "Just a little, my dearest, because you are so good." And he bent down and kissed the little round face raised in such profound adoration to his. "You see," he continued, "it is never safe to feel oneself safe from any particular temptation. The question, 'Is thy servant a dog, that he should do this thing?' is frequently answered by the servant doing the very thing that he condemned as dog-like. I have seen this happen over and over again in my experience as a parish priest. Whenever I heard a man say, 'Oh, such and such a thing may be dangerous for certain persons, but I can do it with impunity,' I know that the devil has made everything ready for the overthrow of that particular man." "But surely, Gabriel, no man is tempted above that which he is able to bear. We are expressly told that a way of escape is always provided." "So it is. But it does not follow that we shall always be willing to avail ourselves of that way. Therefore I hold that it is necessary for the best of men, as for the worst, to raise to heaven the daily petition, 'Lead us not into temptation.' for we have to be in the thick of temptation before we realize how irresistible it is. Thus Gabriel and Janet passed the long evening in holding sweet converse about all the deeper interests of life. They reasoned high of Providence, foreknowledge, will, and fate, and everything else that concerned their truest welfare. The next day was wet and inclined to be misty. There was not much good or much pleasure to be derived from going out in such raw, damp weather, but the holiday was so near its conclusion that the newly wedded pair felt they could not squander any of the few remaining hours of their honeymoon by spending them in the house. So they were out on the moor all morning in spite of driving rain and mist. But it requires more than feminine fortitude to be wet through twice in one day, so after lunch Janet decided that she really could not brave the inclement elements again, especially as there was no special object to be gained by so doing. Gabriel therefore went out for a good spin across the moor by himself, leaving Janet to amuse herself with an interesting book until his return, and faithfully promising to be back in time for tea. He loved to be in solitude upon that wild stretch of country. There was something in the atmosphere of the moor which appealed to one side of his nature, the side which Janet could not understand. Different phases of natural scenery call forth various emotions of the human heart. When we wander upon the seashore, we feel a restless sadness and an unsatisfied longing quivering within us. When we tread the leafy glades of a forest, thoughts of romance and heroism stir our blood. Dreams of simple joys and domestic happiness delight us as we look down upon a rural landscape of cornfields and meadows and red-roofed homesteads, whilst we seem to come within reach of the great secrets of eternity when we stand under the shadow of the everlasting hills. And in the same way, wild stretches of moorland call up an answering spirit within us, but it is not a spirit which makes for righteousness and peace. The spirit of the moorland is a fierce, untutored spirit, with the restlessness of the sea without its sanctifying sadness, and with the mystery of the mountains without their soul-restoring peace. Demons that would shrivel into nothingness before the awful mysteriousness of sea or mountain fly shrieking over the moorland to their evil heart's content. Witches that would be powerless to withstand the spell of homestead or forest ride recklessly upon the swirling blasts that sweep across the heath. True, the moorlands have their fascination for those who understand them, but it is the fascination of evil rather than of good, for evil is strong in those desert places, and the powers of darkness hold high carnival there. One can imagine the scapegoat with his necklet of scarlet dashing to and fro across the dreary scene, or the child whose hand was doomed to be against every man, wandering with his outcast mother across the barren waste. And surely he who knew what was in man knew this also, knew that the spirit of the waste places of the earth was at war with the Spirit of God, and that evil had more power in the desert than on the shores of Gennesaret and in the groves of Olivet, when he went apart into the wilderness there to be tempted of the devil. After Gabriel had gone out, Janet was so much absorbed in her book that for an hour or so she never even looked out of the window. But when at last she did so, she was somewhat disturbed to see that the mist had turned into a thick fog. This did not, however, unduly distress her, partly because she was not a woman with a genius for worry, and partly because her husband knew the moor so well that she believed he would have been able to find his way across it blindfold. But when tea time came and no Gabriel, she began to feel anxious, and when dinner time came and still no Gabriel, she felt more anxious still. And when at last bedtime came, and he had not returned, her distress of mind was very great indeed. The innkeeper and his wife were deeply concerned and extremely sympathetic, but they pointed out to Janet that it would be useless, and worse than useless, to send men out to seek for her lost husband in such a fog as this, as it was now so thick that even a lantern could not be seen for more than a yard in front. They assured the half distraught little bride that her husband, finding it hopeless to make his way back through the fog, had doubtless taken refuge in some shepherd's hut or sheltered spot, and would remain there until the fog lifted. And with this poor Janet had to be content, although no sleep visited her eyes that night. The poor girl never even attempted to go to bed, but sat up all night long, alternately crying and praying for Gabriel. Next morning the fog had cleared, and search parties were immediately organized to go in quest of the lost bridegroom. All day long they scoured the moor, but alas, with no result. Not a trace of the missing man could they find. The assistance of the police was soon called in, but was likewise of no avail. Gabriel Carr seemed to have been swept off the face of the earth. Janet's agony was almost more than she could bear. It seemed too cruel to have attained, after years of hope deferred, her heart's desire, only to have the cup dashed from her lips at the very moment of fruition. Of course she telegraphed to her husband's friends, and Captain Gaythorne and his mother came to her at once. Poor Mrs. Carr was so prostrated by the news of her son's disappearance that she was confined to her bed and unable to travel. But Mrs. Gaythorne was a rock in times of trouble, and Janet was more thankful to her than she could express. Yet even Mrs. Gaythorne was unable to find the missing rector. All the searchers comforted Janet with the assurance that if, as she feared, her husband had lost his life upon the moor, some trace of his body must have been found. There are no glaciers upon Dartmoor, as there are in Switzerland, down which a man may fall headlong, leaving no trace behind: and as no one could have walked fast in such a fog, he really would not have had time to go so very far afield before the fog lifted and he could see his way about again. But if he were still alive, what had become of him? What was he doing whilst his newly made wife was eating her very heart out for want of him? There was the question which no one could answer, at least no one who was ignorant of what powers of darkness had been let loose that night upon Dartmoor to work their wicked will, no one who knew not how good and evil had met and fought together in that wilderness, and how evil had won the day and had prevailed. Mrs. Gaythorne was as loving as any mother to poor Janet. Nothing could exceed her care of and tenderness for the unhappy little bride, who seemed to be neither wife nor widow. It was at times such as this that Charlie's mother showed her best, and therefore her real self. As for Janet, she was well nigh broken-hearted. Could anyone imagine a more tragic ending to a honeymoon than this? She wandered out all day and every day upon the moor, in the vain hope of finding her lost husband, with Mrs. Gaythorne in close attendance, that good woman knowing neither hunger nor fatigue where the fulfilment of what she considered her duty was concerned. Like many of her particular school of thought, a school of thought which is nowadays well nigh obsolete, Mrs. Gaythorne made up for the sternness of her principles by the wisdom and tenderness of her practices. Her written epistle might be a hard saying, but as a living epistle, known and read of all men, she set forth in unmistakable terms the gospel of love. One evening Captain Gaythorne came into the inn parlour, where his mother happened to be sitting alone, Janet having retired to her own desolate chamber to weep, and weep undisturbed. "It's all up," he said, hopelessly, as he sank into a chair. "We had better pack up and go home to morrow." "Charles, do you mean to tell me that poor young man's corpse has been found at last?" Charlie groaned. "Worse than that, mother." "There is nothing worse than death," replied Mrs. Gaythorne. "I mean, of course, for the survivors," she added hastily. "Yes, mother, there is. Disgrace is worse than death." Mrs. Gaythorne drew herself up. "Charles, never let me hear you use such a word as disgrace in connection with that man of God, Gabriel Carr." "It sticks in my throat, I can tell you, mother, but I'm afraid you'll use it yourself when you hear what I've heard." "And what is that, Charles? Where did they find the corpse of that excellent young man?" "They haven't found it at all. Don't you see, mother? There's no corpse in the question. That's the whole point of the thing." "Charles, explain yourself." Captain Gaythorne endeavoured, as he had always endeavoured from his youth up, to obey his mother, but lucidity of expression had never been one of his most distinguishing characteristics. "Well, you see, the police have at last traced Carr to Newton Abbot." "Newton Abbot? What on earth did he want at Newton Abbot? And on his honeymoon, too? That's just the whole point." "Then I don't believe he ever went there. Gabriel was the last man to do anything foolish, especially in a thick fog, except, of course, in matters of ritual, with regard to which he always seemed to have a bee in his bonnet, to say the least of it. But he was not a fool all through, and it is one thing to have early services and flowers upon the communion table, and quite another to go to Newton Abbot in a dense fog on your honeymoon with no object." "All the same, he went there, mother. An old fossil of a farmer has turned up who gave him a lift in his cart as far as Newton Abbot." Mrs. Gaythorne still bristled all over with doubts. "And what did he do when he got to Newton Abbot, I should like to know?" "He went straight to the station, and off to London by the next train." "The railway fellows can tell us all about that, as they sold him his ticket and saw him get into the train." "I do not believe a word of it. It is a faked up story, invented to injure Gabriel and to annoy me." "But, mother, you must believe it. A countryman drove a parson in a grey Norfolk suit, and exactly answering to the description of Carr, into Newton Abbot on the morning after the fog." "That is not proof. There may have been hundreds of clergymen in grey Norfolk suits wandering upon Dartmoor in the fog, for all I know. Besides, I never believe the word of agricultural labourers without some proof." "Well, mother, if you doubt the evidence of the farmer and the railway people and the whole of Scotland Yard put together, you can't doubt the evidence of your own senses. Look here. Carr left this behind in the cart when he got out at Newton Abbot." And Charlie spread out before his mother's eyes one of Gabriel's pocket handkerchiefs, neatly and clearly marked with his name by the careful and efficient Janet. Then at last Mrs. Gaythorne was convinced. For some minutes she sat quite still, great tears rolling down her weather-beaten cheeks. "Oh, Charles, what does it mean?" she said after a time. "What does it mean?" And it was pitiful to hear the quiver in the usually steady voice. "I'm afraid it means that Carr has behaved like a blackguard, mother." "But he was such a good man," Mrs. Gaythorne pleaded. "Such a sincere and God-fearing man, though in some matters so misguided." "I know that, mother. But even the best of men come a cropper sometimes, don't you know? Look at King David and Lord Nelson." "Charles, never let me hear you couple again the name of the sweet singer of Israel with that of the lover of Lady Hamilton." Charlie was contrite at once. "I beg your pardon, mother. I didn't mean to rough you up. All I meant was that it's sometimes too difficult even for the best of men to keep straight. Women haven't the ghost of an idea how deuced difficult it is." "But women have a very good idea indeed of how distressing it is when they do not," replied Mrs. Gaythorne, with some truth. "My idea is," said Charlie, who had inherited a goodly portion of his mother's sound sense, "that Carr made a mistake in marrying a quiet, dowdy girl like Janet Field. She wasn't the sort to hold a brilliant, good-looking fellow like him, don't you know? Showy men want showy wives to hold them, or else there's soon the devil to pay." "There are other attractions than those of the flesh, Charles. I was never a particularly handsome woman, but I had no difficulty in holding your father. He always did exactly as I told him from the day of our marriage till the hour of his death." Charlie fully believed this. Of course, mother, and you are very good looking all the same. But I mean I never much believe in those boy and girl sort of attachments. You see, Janet was always like a sister to Carr, and she had no more influence over him than a sister would have. A man wants something stronger than a milk and water, brother and sister feeling to satisfy him in married life. Why, it even says in the prayer book that a man may not marry his sister any more than his grandmother, and that's the same principle, don't you know?" "Charles, I admit there is something in what you say, but that does not seem to me to excuse a man from running away from his wife on his honeymoon." "Of course not: but in a way it explains it. I believe that poor Carr married Janet out of a sense of duty or honour or something of that kind, because she'd been in love with him from a kid, and then when he'd done it he found it was more than he could stand, so he just cut and run. You see, clever people find it awfully slow to be married to people who aren't clever," Charlie added ruefully, remembering how obviously he himself always bored his wife. "We must keep this from Janet at all costs," said Mrs. Gaythorne, after a short pause. "It is better for her to think her husband dead than false." "We can't keep it from her, mother. The papers to morrow will be full of it, and you know how she reads every word." "Then we cannot keep it from her, Charles. She must know the worst, and perhaps it is better that she should. We cannot spare people more than God intends to spare them, and it is no use our trying to do so, and surely the Lord knows best." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of the Subjection of Isabel Carnaby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Subjection of Isabel Carnaby by Ellen Thornycroft Fowler. Chapter 16. Forsaken. On her return from her ill-starred honeymoon, Janet insisted upon taking up her abode at Gaythorne Rectory as if nothing had happened. She had read in the papers the account of Gabriel's departure to London from Newton Abbot, and had been wonderfully comforted by this proof that her husband was still alive. But she absolutely refused to believe any ill of him. She persisted that he must have had some good reason for rushing off to London in that strange fashion, or else he would never have done so. And she was convinced that before long he would return to Gaythorne and take up his duties there, with a full and satisfactory explanation of his apparently unjustifiable conduct. Her absolute faith in him remained unshaken. But this attitude of mind on Janet's part made things very awkward for other people. The parish of Gaythorne was practically without a rector, and as Carr had not resigned the living, and there was no proof of his death, but rather the contrary, he still held the incumbency, and therefore a new rector could not as yet be instituted in his place. So it was arranged between the bishop and Mrs. Gaythorne, who were great friends, that for the present at any rate Janet and her mother-in-law should draw the stipend and stay on at the rectory, while a curate should be paid by Mrs. Gaythorne to take charge of the parish, which was a very small one, and to do duty in the church. Weeks rolled on, and nothing further was heard of the missing Gabriel. It seemed as if the Devonshire farmer had indeed seen the last of him, and as if when he left the station of Newton Abbot he had disappeared for ever. But his wife's faith in him remained untouched. She still clung as closely as ever to her conviction that one day he would come back and explain everything, and stand justified in the eyes of the world, though how he would do it she had not the ghost of an idea. Mrs. Gaythorne, however, had her own explanation of his apparently inexplicable conduct. She was bound to arrive at a conclusion of some sort, as it was agony to her to feel that there was anything in heaven or earth undreamed of in her own peculiar philosophy. "I have made up my mind what has become of Gabriel Carr," she announced one morning at breakfast, a couple of months after the rector's disappearance. Her son and daughter-in-law were sitting with her at the table, as well as Isabel Seaton, who was spending a few days at Gaythorne Manor, while Paul delivered a course of political speeches in the north of England. Isabel had been very much attached to Gabriel, and very much surprised and disturbed at first by his disappearance, but she had soon got over it. It is astonishing how little power events outside the circle of her own household and family have in destroying the peace of the happily married woman. Things which would have agonized her in her single days hardly disturb her at all. Mrs. Paul Seaton had much in common with the old woman who said that as long as her husband's dinner didn't disagree with him, she didn't mind how soon there was a European war. It is by no means an uncommon type, for matrimony, when reverently, discreetly, and advisedly taken in hand, becomes an absorbing profession. "How clever of you, Mrs. Gaythorne!" exclaimed Isabel. "Do let us hear what it is." "I believe that ritualism, and nothing else but ritualism, is responsible for all the trouble," replied Mrs. Gaythorne, as ever true to her colours. "But there's nothing in the ornaments rubric in favour of deserting your wife on her honeymoon," argued the irrepressible Isabel. "But there's something in the Bible about people with wives being as though they hadn't any," hastily added Charlie, wishing to agree with his mother, and believing that he was doing so. But Mrs. Gaythorne was not so easily agreed with. "No, Charles, I think you have misinterpreted that particular text, but you shall look it up in the commentary as soon as you have finished your breakfast, and see exactly what it means. My impression, however, is that it was not intended to inculcate the regular practice of such behaviour as Gabriel's." Charlie at once submitted. He felt that, with the best of intentions, he had somehow made a mistake. Here Fabia broke into the conversation. "He who weds and runs away may live to wed another day, and another young woman." Mrs. Gaythorne pursed up her lips in stern disapproval. "No, my dear, Gabriel Carr was never one of that sort. I've known him from a child, and his mother before him, and that is the last thing that either of them would ever think of doing." "Still, I must say there is something in Fabia's idea," said Charlie. "He was always ready, whenever it was possible, to show up his wife to his mother in a favourable light. This was one of the poor fellow's many conjugal mistakes. There is nothing that a wife resents more than being screened by her husband from her husband's relations, just as there is nothing that makes a husband more indignant than being translated with emendations by his wife, in order to earn the approval of his wife's people. Yet the intention on both sides arises from the best of motives, although it generally brings about the very result that it was originated to avoid. Unsanctified human nature cannot endure to be revised and Baudelarized for the benefit of its in-laws. "We don't want to hear what you say. We want to hear what Mrs. Gaythorne thinks," was Fabia's unwifely retort. Poor Charlie again subsided. "What is your idea about Gabriel Carr, Mrs. Gaythorne?" Fabia continued. "It is not an idea, Fabia: it is a conviction. It has been borne in upon me that Gabriel has so saturated his mind with popish notions about monks and nuns and celibates and all sorts of profane nonsense of that kind, that they turned his brain. Never very strong at the best of times, or else he would not have gone in for the mummeries he did. By the way, what do they call a nunnery for monks?" Mrs. Gaythorne always shammed ignorance upon subjects such as this, in the same way as his Majesty's judges frequently feign an ignorance to which they really have no claim with regard to matters unconnected with their high profession. Just as a judge would feel it incumbent upon him, in his official capacity, to assume innocence regarding race meetings and the like, so Mrs. Gaythorne felt it incumbent upon her high calling as a militant Protestant to know nothing whatsoever about the ceremonies and institutions sanctioned by Catholicism in any form. "I suppose you mean a monastery," replied Fabia. "Monastery, indeed! I should rather call it a monkey house," retorted Mrs. Gaythorne with grim humour. "Well, I am convinced that Gabriel was suddenly seized with a ridiculous and papistical notion that all clergymen ought to be bachelors, and so he fled away from Janet into a monastery. What are those horrible places called where no women are admitted and nobody is allowed to speak, Fabia?" "Trappist monasteries, do you mean?" "Yes, that is the name, and a very suitable name too, for they are indeed traps set by the devil to catch the souls of men. Not long ago I read a novel about a man who, after he was married, remembered that he was a Trappist monk. So he at once gave up being married and returned to his monastery. I thought it a most improper proceeding on his part, but I feel convinced in my own mind that poor Gabriel has gone and done likewise." "But Carr wasn't a Trappist before his marriage," objected Captain Gaythorne. His mother shook her head ominously. "You never can tell what those high church parsons may be in disguise. I daresay he was a Trappist, and a Jesuit as well, if we only knew. Lots of them are, and believe that they are thereby doing good service." "But Carr would never have justified a married man going into a monastery unless there'd have been some rattling good reason for it," persisted Charlie. "You can bet your boots upon that." "Anybody who will justify a man, under any circumstances, in hiding himself in one of those dreadful, horrible nunneries, will justify anything," replied Mrs. Gaythorne, unwittingly speaking the truth, as a man in a nunnery would indeed be as dreadful a thing as a lion among ladies. "And, Charles, never again let me hear you use such an objectionable word as bet, for betting is one of the things that I have never allowed either you or your father to indulge in, and never shall." "I don't agree with Mrs. Gaythorne that Gabriel has followed Hamlet's advice and got into a nunnery," said Isabel; "but I shouldn't be surprised if she were correct in the spirit, if not in the letter, and that some impractical and quixotic notion were accountable for his disappearance. I feel certain that he thought he was doing right, or he wouldn't have done it." Charlie looked doubtful. "It's all very well to be romantic and quixotic and all that sort of thing, but deserting your wife on your honeymoon is rather a large order." "I agree with Charlie's notion," said Fabia, "that Janet bored him so intensely that he literally could not stand another day of her." Charlie beamed with pleasure at the great compliment Fabia paid him in endorsing his opinion on any matter. "He is a clever sort of chap, and he wanted a clever sort of wife to keep him company, don't you know." "I daresay Mrs. Gabriel Carr isn't a dazzling genius," remarked Isabel, "but I shouldn't have called her by any means a fool. She seemed to me the pleasant, easy-going sort of girl that one asks in at the last moment to make the 14th at table, and things of that kind. I saw her once or twice before her marriage, and that is how she struck me. Not too clever to get married, and yet too stupid to remain single. The sort of woman that makes a man really happy." Isabel was always ready, and more than ready, to do justice to another woman. "But she's so short. Captain Gaythorne, like Lord Byron, hated a dumpy woman." Still, he knew that when he proposed to her," retorted Mrs. Seaton. "It is absurd to marry a woman of 5'3" and then to run away because she doesn't grow to 5'6" before the end of the honeymoon. If you want outside ladies' size, you must order it in the first instance." "I did," replied Charlie, looking at his tall wife with adoration in his honest eyes. "We are all as God made us," said Mrs. Gaythorne, her voice heavy with reproof. "But you can't deny that you are glad that there was no skimping in your case, Mrs. Gaythorne, and that you were cut out a good 5'7", with ample material for bodice." "Isabella Carnaby, do not be flippant." It was a habit of Mrs. Gaythome's frequently to address married ladies by their maiden names. It was also her habit never to use a diminutive, diminutives being among the numerous things of which she disapproved. "I'll try not, but it is difficult to change the habits of a lifetime at my age," replied Mrs. Seaton meekly. "Nevertheless," added Mrs. Gaythorne, who was nothing if not accurate, "I confess that it is a cause of thankfulness on my part that it was ordained by Providence that I should not be a small or insignificant person. Presence is a thing which I have always considered most important, my dear Isabella." Isabella was not Isabel's name, but Mrs. Gaythorne thought it ought to have been, and so invariably addressed her by it. She regarded the name Isabel in the light of a diminutive, and disapproved of it accordingly. "It's always a mistake for a fellow to marry a dowdy little woman," said Charles sententiously. "Frumps have no staying power." "And it is an equally grave mistake for a girl to marry a fool," replied Fabia. Charlie winced, but Isabel came to his rescue. "Lots have to, or they'd never get married at all. Nobody but a fool would propose to them." Thus Gabriel Carr's friends discussed his mysterious disappearance, and none of them could come to any satisfactory conclusion, since none of them knew of the tragedy which had occurred upon Dartmoor on the night of the fog. That was known to only two living people, and of these the instinct of self-preservation forbade the one to tell, and nobody would accept the testimony of the other, so the secret was in safe keeping. Janet was very brave, but her sorrow told upon her. Her face grew older and her figure less plump, and the merry look died out of her hazel eyes. But she carried a bold front before the world, and she abundantly fulfilled her duty to her husband's parish. She was an ideal wife for any clergyman, and even the overwhelming blow which had well nigh crushed her in no wise interfered with her adequacy in adorning the lot to which she had been called. The parish of Gaythorne was but a small parish, it is true, but it was better looked after than any other parish in the county, every cottage being constantly visited, and every sick person carefully ministered to by Janet herself. Thus her desolate days were filled with deeds of charity and acts of mercy, and so were kept from being quite as desolate as they would otherwise have been, for work, and especially work for others, is the best panacea for the pain of the human heart. Another source of comfort to Janet was the possession of a gift which is usually reserved for the stronger sex, and is rarely bestowed upon women, namely, the gift of not seeing anything that she did not wish to see. Women, as a rule, are too keen-sighted and too quick in their perceptions to be able to close their eyes at will, for a stone wall is generally to them as plate glass. But men, happy creatures, have a marvellous power of not seeing the unpleasant truth at all, unless they desire to do so. Even though you may illuminate it with Chinese lanterns and dangle it under their very noses, they will remain as blind as if it were an undiscovered planet. They do not choose to see it, therefore for them it does not exist. Most men are mute inglorious Nelsons, putting the telescope to their blind eyes when they think the signals will be against their wishes. It is a most comfortable and convenient custom, and shows the superior wisdom of the sex which is proficient in it. Janet Carr, however, had less subtlety than the majority of women, and less quickness of perception. As a matter of fact, she was almost as easily deceived, when she wished to be, as a man. She had none of that marvellous power of intuition which distinguishes some, and not always the cleverest, women. And she had intensely strong and deeply rooted prejudices, things which are always useful as blinkers. Therefore the stream of gossip about Gabriel flowed by her unheeded. She was as little affected by it as a man would have been. But Janet's chief stronghold lay in the fact that she never for a moment doubted her husband, or questioned the purity of his motives and the soundness of his wisdom in leaving her. What wise reason had prompted his apparently unaccountable action she of course could not tell. But that there was a reason, and an all-sufficient one, she had not the faintest shadow of a doubt. Thus she not only fulfilled her duty to her husband's parish, but she also fulfilled her duty to her husband, the parish priest. She regarded the husband as the head of the wife, and therefore held that it was not in the wife's province to criticize his actions, nor to question his motives. She was accountable to him, but he was not accountable to her. It was a counsel of perfection, perhaps, but perfection does not spell impossibility. Otherwise, "Be ye perfect" would never have been a command issued to the sons of men. Janet Carr implicitly obeyed the apostolic injunction that wives must be in subjection to their own husbands. She had no new-fangled modern notions as to the equality of the sexes and the independence of the wife. She was content to accept the holy estate of matrimony as what God and Church ordained it to be, and she did not trouble her mind with problems as to the permanence of home life or the sanctity of marriage. To her, marriage was a sacrament, and was therefore not open to observation, and she held as most unseemly the modern habit of setting aside, by means of problem novels and scientific treatises and open discussion in the daily papers, the very oracles of God. She would as soon have thought of wondering whether the grass were red or the sky green, as of wondering whether the bond of holy wedlock were dissoluble. She believed in her husband's integrity with all her heart, believed that what he had been done with the best of motives, and would end in the most satisfactory of results. But if she had not believed this, it would have made no difference at all in her attitude towards him. If she could have been convinced that he had purposely forsaken her and had been wholly unfaithful, she would not have regarded herself as one whit the less his wife, or considered her duty to him as in any way cancelled. Such was the simple faith of Janet Carr, an outworn creed according to modern notions, and one which contained in its vocabulary no such words as incompatibility of temper, temperamental differences, and the like. But it satisfied her, and was founded upon the truth according to her judgment, and I think also that she, like St. Paul, had the Spirit of God. End of chapter 16.